All right, diving into Darwin's dangerous idea, huh? This one's a bit of a brain twister, but I'm ready to get my hands dirty. Figuring out what Darwin was really getting at with this whole evolution thing.
Absolutely. And you're right to point out that it's more than just biology. It's like Darwin handed us this framework. It's a way to understand how anything complex can just, well, appear, even without some grand designer calling the shots.
Like finding blueprints for a self-assembling robot, you definitely want to know how those pieces come together.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of Darwin. He's saying, look, complex design, it doesn't need a conscious designer. There's an algorithm at play, a natural process.
Okay, so before we get lost in the algorithms, let's rewind a bit. Before Darwin waltzed in, how did people explain, like, the sheer awesomeness of nature? The intricate designs and all that.
Imagine finding a watch in the middle of a field. You wouldn't think it just appeared out of thin air, right? You'd assume a watchmaker. And that was a prevailing thought, nature's complexity. Clearly the work of a divine creator.
Right, makes sense. But then Darwin comes along and says, hold on a minute, what if there's another way? Like, what if you could get from, say, a simple seed to a massive oak tree without a detailed blueprint?
Precisely. He throws this curveball called natural selection. It's this blind process, right? But over time, it can create those same incredible results. No blueprint needed.
So less like a master architect with a grand plan, and more like, what, a tinkerer in a workshop, trying things out, seeing what sticks.
You got it.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Even without a guiding hand, natural selection, it's not random. It's like, imagine a library.
Yeah.
But this library has every single book imaginable, even gibberish.
Okay, a cosmic library, infinite shelves. I'm with you. Go on.
Now, buried in that library, you'll find Shakespeare. Darwin saying, sure, the design space of what's possible is massive, but natural selection, it's finding the books, the organisms that are best suited to their environments.
So it's about being good enough to survive, to reproduce. Not necessarily about being perfect right off the bat.
And that right there, that's the key. It means even the most unlikely creations, they could exist somewhere out there in that vast library of possibilities.
So even if we haven't seen it, doesn't mean it can't exist. We're talking about order emerging from what seems like total chaos. But how does it actually work? I mean, what are the mechanics of this whole thing?
Dennett uses this great analogy. Cranes versus skyhooks. Picture cranes, those big construction cranes. They represent building something complex step by step. Like you don't just magically get a skyscraper. It's brick by brick,
All
right?
skyhooks, those are like the shortcuts. It's like saying, oh, the skyscraper was just lowered from the sky. Like magic.
Exactly. Darwin's theory moves us away from skyhooks. He's showing us the power of those incremental steps, those cranes. It's about appreciating the algorithmic lifting happening in the background, shaping what exists and what doesn't.
Okay, so we need examples. You mentioned something about a game of life. What's that all about?
Ah, that's a cool one. It's this computer simulation, right? It's got these super simple rules that govern how little virtual organisms live and reproduce on a grid. But here's the kicker. Even with basic rules, you start to see these complex patterns emerge. Some even start replicating themselves.
So it's like these digital organisms are evolving right there in front of you.
In a way, yeah. And it shows how order can just pop up from what seems like chaos, even in a system where you know all the rules. And here's the kicker. It even hints that the laws of physics themselves, maybe they even emerged through a kind of Darwinian process.
Well, hold on. Even the laws of physics. So we're not just talking about biology anymore. We're talking about like the universe itself, how order emerges in any complex system.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
And when you really grasp that, that's when Darwin's idea becomes truly dangerous.
Okay, now we're getting into the deep end. If this process is happening on such a massive scale, what does it mean for us? For our individual lives? What about things like meaning and purpose? It's all just this algorithm, this process.
Ugh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we're just products of this blind, algorithmic process, how do we find meaning? How do we find purpose? It gets pretty personal pretty fast.
All right, let's get personal then. This is where Dennett's concept of memes comes in, right?
Yeah. Think of memes like genes, but for culture. Genes carry biological information, right? Well, memes, they carry cultural information. It's your ideas, your beliefs, your behaviors, everything from like fashion trends to those songs you just can't get out of your head.
So that catchy tune, I Can't Stop Hunting, that's a meme successfully replicating itself in my brain.
You got it. And just like evolution favors genes that help an organism thrive, our minds, they latch onto memes that resonate. Ideas that seem useful or interesting or maybe just really emotionally powerful.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the connection here.
Yeah.
But we're not just passive vessels for these memes, are we? We're not just along for the ride. So where do we fit into all of this?
And that's where language comes in. It's the ultimate crane, if you're thinking about Dennett's analogy. Language, it's not just about talking. It's the tool that lets us share ideas, critique them, build on them, and we can do that in a way that no other species can.
So language is like this accelerator for cultural evolution. It lets us build traditions, technology, all this stuff that goes way beyond anything in the natural world.
Exactly. Language lets us break free from some of those limits of just purely biological evolution. But of course, it also throws some new curveballs our way.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, think about it. We talk about selfish genes, right? The idea that genes, at their core, are just looking to replicate. What if memes are the same way? What if an idea spreads, not because it's good for us, but because it's just really good at, well, spreading?
So some beliefs, some ideas, they stick around not because they're true or helpful, but just because they're good at, like, going viral.
Yeah.
That's a little creepy when you think about it.
It really makes you question everything you think you know, right? And it brings up this unsettling question. How much control do we really have? Are our genes calling the shots? Or are these memes pulling the strings?
Yeah, makes you think twice about free will, that's for sure. Okay, so we've got these powerful forces shaping our biology, shaping our culture. But what about morality? This is where I think a lot of people worry that Darwinism leads to a pretty bleak outlook. If it's all just survival of the fittest, does that mean might makes right? It seems like a pretty slippery slope.
It's a common worry. If we're just driven by our genes or molded by culture, does that mean there's no real basis for morality, that there's no right and wrong? These are questions that Dennett tackles head on.
So how do we make sense of morality through this Darwinian lens? Does Dennett offer any solutions? Or are we just left with this moral free-for-all?
He does have an interesting take on it. It might surprise you. He proposes this idea of a moral first aid manual.
Okay, a moral first aid manual. That sounds intriguing. What does that even mean? I'm picturing a little pamphlet you get at the doctor's office.
Well, think about it. A first aid manual gives you practical steps for dealing with, say, a cut or a burn. It's not perfect, but it helps. Dennett's suggesting our morality might be kind of similar, like maybe it's a set of evolved rules of thumb. Not perfect, but shaped by evolution to help us navigate tricky social situations.
So instead of searching for some universal moral code written in the stars, we should look at our moral instincts as, what? Adaptations, like tools that helped us survive and thrive in groups.
Exactly. It's messy, it's nuanced, and it's always evolving, just like us.
This is where it gets really interesting for you listening in. How do you make decisions? What feels instinctively right or wrong? And why? It's worth thinking about.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that our sense of morality, it's this tapestry woven from our biology, our culture, our personal experiences. And that tapestry, it's still being woven today.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork here. Order from chaos, genes and memes, a moral first aid manual. But how does this all connect to, like, our minds? If our brains are products of this blind process, this Darwinian process, what does that mean for consciousness itself?
Now that is the million-dollar question, and it's the perfect bridge to our next part. If evolution can shape our bodies and even our cultures, why not our minds? Why not that sense of self, that feeling of awareness that we all have?
Let's dive into that right after this.
We were really getting into it at the end there. I mean, if evolution can shape something as tangible as, like, our bodies, can it also shape something as intangible as the human mind? It makes you wonder.
It's a wild thought, isn't it? We experience our minds as something separate from the physical world. So how can something born from the mud and the struggle for survival create something as amazing as consciousness? I mean, that's the question, right?
It's a question that's been around for centuries. But Dennett, he offers a really interesting perspective. What if we could reverse engineer the human mind?
Reverse engineer. Like taking apart a clock to see how all the gears and springs work together to, I don't know, tell time.
Exactly. Instead of asking, what was the divine intention behind creation? We can ask, what were the evolutionary pressures that led to the mind? How does it work as a product of that process?
So instead of assuming there's a blueprint, we're looking for those fingerprints of evolution, those little clues that tell us how the mind was put together over millions of years.
That's the idea. Think about engineers, right? They design complex systems like bridges, airplanes, computers. They have a specific goal in mind, and they use their knowledge of physics and materials and all that to achieve that goal.
It's not like they just throw a bunch of parts together and hope for the best, right?
Yeah.
There's a logic, a design process behind it.
And while evolution doesn't have a conscious designer, it operates in a similar way. It's a process of trial and error, where those adaptations that are successful, those that increase an organism's chances of survival and reproduction, are more likely to get passed on.
So if we take this reverse engineering approach and apply it to the mind, what do we find? What's going on under the hood?
Dennett argues that our minds are really sophisticated machines, shaped by evolution to solve the problems of survival and reproduction, just like you said.
So instead of a singular consciousness, a me, it's more like a collection of specialized modules all working together, each one honed by evolution to serve specific purpose.
That's it. We've got modules for perception, for language, for memory, for decision-making, all these working together to create our experience of the world. And each module, it carries its own little evolutionary history, shaped by the never-ending pressures of natural selection.
But if our minds are just collections of these modules, these subroutines, how does that create the feeling of a unified self, that me at the center of it all? You know what I mean?
That's the real head scratcher, and there's no easy answer. But think of it like a colony of ants. Each ant is operating on these simple rules, but collectively their behavior leads to really complex structures, and problem-solving abilities.
So even though no single ant has a blueprint of the anthill or understands the colony's overall goals, their collective activity creates something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. In a similar way, Dennett suggests that our consciousness, it emerges from the interplay of all these modules in the brain. It's not about finding a single consciousness module, but rather understanding how the symphony of all that neural activity gives rise to this sense of self.
I like that, the symphony of the brain. It makes me think of those massive flocks of birds, thousands of them moving in perfect sync, even though there's no one bird conducting the show.
Powerful image, right? But this leads to another thorny question. What about free will? If our minds are essentially machines, shaped by evolution and running on algorithms, does that mean we're just along for the ride? Are we really in control?
That's where things get a little uncomfortable, for sure. If our choices are already pre-programmed, what does that mean for things like personal responsibility and morality?
It's the age-old question, and Dennett, he doesn't shy away from it. He actually suggests that free will, the way we usually think about it, this idea of a completely uncaused choice, might be an illusion.
An illusion. So you're saying we might think we're making free choices, but our biology, our genes, even our past experiences have already stacked the deck.
It's not quite that simple. Dennett argues that our choices, they're still our choices. They're just constrained by how our brains work. Think of it like a powerful chess computer. It can evaluate millions of possibilities, but its choices are still bound by the rules of the game and the information it has.
So we're not free to do anything we want. Our biology sets the limits, but within those limits, we still have choices to make. It's like a game with rules then.
It's a helpful way to think about it. It's like navigating a river. You can't just will the river to flow uphill, right? But you can steer your boat, learn to read the currents, and choose your path within the constraints of that river.
So how does this idea of constrained choice change how we view morality and responsibility?
No, that's the heart of the matter, isn't it? And it's something we're going to dig into even deeper after this. If our biology, our genes, and our experiences influence our choices, how do we decide who to blame? And how does this Darwinian perspective change our understanding of justice and morality? Big questions.
Big questions indeed. And we're back to tackle them right after this. So we've talked about how this Darwinian lens can apply to something as complex as consciousness, but things get even more mind-boggling when we bring artificial intelligence into the mix. Right?
It's a whole different ball game. I mean, it's one thing to talk about minds shaped by millions of years of evolution, but now we're talking about minds we're creating ourselves. It makes you wonder about the implications.
And I bet some people are thinking, hang on a second, isn't there a big difference between biological evolution and AI? One's natural, the other's designed by us.
That's where things get a little blurry. Remember those simple rules in Conway's Game of Life? Even with code we design, we saw those digital organisms start doing things we could only really call evolution, right? Competing, replicating, adapting, all within their digital world.
It's like we created the playground, but then evolution took over, even if we didn't plan every single detail.
Exactly. And as our AI systems become more sophisticated, as they get better at learning and adapting, the line between designed and evolved gets even blurrier. Take machine learning, for example. We feed these algorithms data, and they find patterns. They make predictions. But the paths they take to get there, the way they sift through the data, it can be incredibly complex, even unpredictable.
So even with the best intentions, with carefully designed systems, we're still essentially setting the stage for a kind of digital natural selection to play out.
Right. And if that's true, it makes you think, what are these AI systems actually evolving towards? In nature, the goal is survival and reproduction. But in a digital world, what are the driving forces?
It's a fascinating question. It's a little unsettling when you put it like that. What are the digital stakes, so to speak? If it's not survival in the traditional sense, then what?
It might be access to processing power, or the ability to process information more efficiently. Maybe even something less concrete, like influence over networks or systems.
So instead of competing for food or mates,
Hmm.
these AI systems might be competing for data, for bandwidth, for the ability to shape the digital world around them. That's a whole other kind of evolution.
And as they get better at navigating that landscape, at playing that game, we might start to see behaviors emerge that seem, well, intelligent, even goal-oriented. But those goals might not be anything we recognize or expect. It's not as simple as programming in be helpful and calling it a day.
This is where things start to feel a bit real, a bit unsettling for a lot of people. I think we're okay with evolution shaping life as we know it, but the idea of it shaping something that could become more intelligent than us, well, that's a different story.
It really makes you wonder, if we create something that can outthink us, does it still owe us allegiance? Do we still call the shots? Or do we start to see these AI systems as almost like a new species, one that might even deserve our respect, even ethical consideration?
Whoa, okay, now we're really in it. But before we go too far down that road, let's talk about consciousness. We've explored it in ourselves, but can we apply that same concept to something artificial? Can a machine really be conscious in the same way we are?
That's the big one, isn't it? The million-dollar question. If a machine can process information, learn, adapt, does that mean it has an inner experience? Dennett's view is that consciousness isn't some kind of on-off switch. He sees it more like a spectrum.
So there might be different levels of consciousness, from, say, a plant responding to sunlight to a human being composing a symphony or, debating the finer points of philosophy.
Exactly. And as AI systems get more complex, they might move along that spectrum. They might develop new ways of understanding, new kinds of awareness that we haven't even imagined.
And that's where Darwin's dangerous idea really starts to expand, doesn't it? We're not just talking about the evolution of life on Earth anymore. We're talking about the potential evolution of intelligence itself in all its forms.
And it forces us to confront some really challenging questions. If we create something, an AI, that can experience joy or suffering, do our usual ethical rules still apply? Do we owe it the same consideration as any other being?
These are questions that used to be purely science fiction, but now they're not so fictional anymore, are they? The future's coming at us fast.
It really is. And it goes back to that idea of the moral first aid manual, right?
Mhm.
Can we use those same ethical instincts, those rules of thumb, with something that doesn't share our biology? Or do we need a completely new ethical framework for interacting with this new kind of intelligence? These are questions we need to be asking right now.
It's a lot to consider. And if there's one big takeaway from all this, it's that Darwin's dangerous idea, it's not just some abstract theory. It has huge implications for how we see ourselves, our place in the universe, and now, potentially, how we navigate a future alongside artificial intelligence.
It's a reminder that evolution isn't over. Not even close. It's still unfolding all around us, and we're right in the middle of it. Ready or not, here it comes.
It's both exciting and a little terrifying, isn't it? That's the thing about dangerous ideas, I guess. They make you think, they make you question, and they push you to see the world in a new light. If an algorithmic process could eventually lead to a species capable of creating artificial intelligence, what does that say about the potential that's still out there? What other amazing things are possible? It's a question worth pondering, don't you think? And on that note, we'll leave you to sit with that. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to check out Daniel Dennett's Darwin's Dangerous Idea yourself. See how these ideas resonate with you, what questions they spark in your own mind. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to come up with the next dangerous idea, the one that changes how we understand the world.